Danny Martinez sat in the crowded waiting room of St. Luke's Medical Center, with his hand pressed against his chest. The pain had started an hour ago while he was fixing his truck in the garage of his small apartment. At first he thought it was just heartburn from the cheap pizza he had eaten for lunch. But the pain kept getting worse and worse until he could barely breathe. He had driven himself to the hospital because calling an ambulance seemed too expensive, and he did not want to bother anyone with his problems. That was just how Danny was, always putting others before himself, even when his own life was in danger. The waiting room was packed with people coughing and sneezing and crying babies and elderly folks in wheelchairs. Danny had checked in with the triage nurse 40 minutes ago, and she had told him the wait time was at least 3 hours because they were short-staffed and overwhelmed. He had nodded and taken his seat and tried to stay calm, but the pain in his chest was spreading down his left arm now and his vision was starting to blur at the edges. He looked around at the busy nurses and doctors rushing past the waiting room entrance and wanted to call out to them, but his voice felt stuck in his throat, and everyone seemed too busy to notice. One more sick person waiting. Danny was 42 years old, and he had served in the Marine Corps for 8 years before getting out and trying to build a normal life. He worked as a mechanic now at a small garage on the edge of town, fixing cars and trucks for people who could not afford the fancy dealerships. The pay was not great, but he liked the work and he liked helping people who reminded him of his own family, working-class folks just trying to get by. He lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment with his old dog, Charlie, and he did not talk much about his time in the service, because the memories were hard and he did not want to burden anyone. The pain was getting unbearable now, and Danny felt sweat pouring down his face even though the waiting room was cold with air conditioning. His hands were shaking and his heart was pounding in his chest like a drum that had lost its rhythm. He tried to stand up to get help, but his legs felt weak, and he slumped back down in the plastic chair. The woman sitting next to him glanced over with concern, but then her name was called and she hurried away to see the doctor. Danny was alone again, with the pain crushing his chest like a vice. He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and stared at the screen for a long moment. He had not asked for help in years. Not since he got out of the Corps, because he believed in handling his own problems and not being a burden. But something in his gut told him this was different, and if he did not reach out now, he might not get another chance. He opened the group chat for his old unit, the guys he had served with in Fallujah 15 years ago. Most of them had moved on with their lives, but they still checked in with each other every few months, sharing jokes and memories and making sure everyone was doing okay. Danny's fingers moved slowly across the screen as he typed out a message. "Brothers, I need help. Heart attack. St. Luke's Hospital. Can't get care." He hit send before he could change his mind and then let the phone drop into his lap. His vision was getting darker now and the sounds of the waiting room seemed far away, like he was underwater. He thought about his old dog Charlie waiting for him at home and hoped someone would remember to feed him if Danny did not make it back. 300 miles away at the Pentagon, Lieutenant Commander Kyle Stevens was sitting at his desk reviewing paperwork when his phone buzzed with the group chat notification. He almost ignored it because he was busy with reports and meetings, but something made him pick up the phone and look at the message. When he saw Danny's words, his blood went cold and he was on his feet before he even realized he was moving. Kyle had served alongside Danny in Iraq, and Danny had saved his life by pulling him from a burning vehicle after an IED attack. Kyle still had scars on his arms from the burns, but he was alive because Danny had risked everything to drag him to safety. Kyle did not hesitate for even a second. He grabbed his phone and started making calls, using every connection he had built during his years in the military. He called Colonel Patricia Hayes at Fort Bragg because she had also served with Danny and he knew she would move heaven and earth to help one of their own. Patricia answered on the second ring, and when Kyle explained the situation, she did not waste time with questions or bureaucracy. She said she would handle it, and Kyle trusted her completely, because that was what their bond meant. That was what being Marines meant. Back at St. Luke's Hospital, Danny's head was slumping forward against his chest and his breathing was shallow and labored. Another patient sitting across the waiting room stood up quickly and rushed to the front desk, telling the nurse that someone looked really sick and needed help right away. The nurse looked over and saw Danny, and her eyes went wide because she recognized the signs of a major cardiac event. She called for help and 2 other nurses came, running with a wheelchair to get Danny back to the emergency room. They got him onto an exam table and started hooking him up to monitors and asking him questions that he could barely answer. His blood pressure was dropping and his heart rhythm was irregular, and the ER doctor who came to examine him looked worried. They started an IV line and gave him aspirin and called for the cardiac team, but the hospital was so overwhelmed that even emergency cases were being delayed. Danny lay there on the table staring up at the fluorescent lights and thinking about all the things he wished he had done differently in his life. He did not know that 300 miles away, Black Hawk helicopter was being fueled and prepped for an emergency flight. He did not know that his brothers from the Corps were moving into action with the same intensity and focus they had shown in combat. He did not know that help was coming fast and hard because when a Marine calls for help, other Marines answer without question or hesitation. All Danny knew was the pain and the fear and the hope that maybe, just maybe, he had done the right thing by reaching out. Colonel Patricia Hayes was in a meeting with junior officers when her phone rang with Kyle's call, and she stepped out into the hallway to take it. When Kyle told her about Danny's message and the situation at St. Luke's Hospital, Patricia felt her stomach drop because she remembered Danny Martinez very well. He had been the kind of Marine who never complained and never quit, and always put his team before himself. During their deployment in Fallujah, Danny had volunteered for the most dangerous patrols and had pulled 2 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire. He had earned a Bronze Star for valor but never talked about it because that was just who he was. Patricia ended the call with Kyle and immediately walked down the corridor to General Richard Burton's office. The general was a tough man with gray hair and sharp eyes who had spent 30 years in the Army and had a reputation for taking care of his people. Patricia knocked once and entered without waiting for permission, because this was an emergency and protocol could wait. She explained the situation quickly and clearly, giving the general all the facts he needed to make a decision. Danny Martinez was a veteran having a heart attack at a civilian hospital that was too overwhelmed to provide immediate care, and he needed help right now, or he might die. General Burton listened without interrupting, and when Patricia finished talking, he sat back in his chair and thought for exactly 10 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called the Base Operations Center and ordered them to prep a medevac Black Hawk with a full emergency medical team. The operations officer on the other end of the line started to ask questions about authorization and protocols, but the general cut him off with a tone that left no room for debate. "Prep the bird now, we have a veteran down and we are going to bring him home." The officer said yes, sir, and the line went dead. Within minutes, the base was moving with the kind of efficiency that only comes from years of training and discipline. At the flight line, Captain Andrew Fisher and Lieutenant Greg Holland were walking to their Black Hawk for a routine training flight when they got the call to divert to emergency medevac operations. Andrew was a 34-year-old pilot with over 2,000 flight hours, and Greg was his co-pilot, younger but just as skilled. They changed course immediately and headed to the helicopter, where the ground crew was already loading medical equipment and checking systems. The medical team arrived running across the tarmac with their gear bags, bouncing against their legs. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez was the flight medic, a compact woman with quick hands and sharp eyes who had done 3 tours in Afghanistan and had saved more lives than she could count. With her was Major Scott Hamilton, an emergency physician who happened to be on base for training exercises and had volunteered immediately when he heard about the mission. Scott was tall and calm with the kind of steady presence that made people trust him. Instantly in a crisis, Maria and Scott climbed into the Black Hawk's medical bay and started checking equipment while Andrew and Greg ran through pre-flight checks in the cockpit. The helicopter's medical compartment was small but packed with advanced life support equipment, including cardiac monitors, defibrillators, ventilators, and enough medications to stabilize almost any emergency. Maria moved through her checks with practice speed, making sure every piece of equipment was ready and every medication was within easy reach. Scott reviewed the limited information they had about the patient. Male, 42 years old, veteran, possible heart attack, at St. Luke's Medical Center. General Burton came out to the flight line personally to see them off, which was unusual but showed how seriously he took this mission. He walked up to the Black Hawk as the rotors started to spin, and had to raise his voice to be heard over the noise. "Bring him home safe," the general said, and Andrew nodded because those were the only orders he needed. The general stepped back and saluted as the Black Hawk lifted off the ground with a powerful roar of engines and rotors beating the air. The way Helicopter climbed into the autumn sky and banked toward St. Luke's Hospital, which was 63 miles away. In the cockpit, Greg was already on the radio coordinating with air traffic control and getting priority clearance for their emergency flight. Every controller they talked to heard the word medevac and immediately moved other aircraft out of their path because saving lives came before schedules and convenience. Andrew pushed the Black Hawk to maximum cruising speed, and the landscape below them blurred into patches of brown and green and gray. In the medical bay, Maria and Scott went over the plan for when they reached the hospital. They would land in the parking lot if possible because that would be fastest, and they would go in fast and get the patient out fast because every second mattered in a cardiac emergency. Scott pulled out his portable medical kit and double-checked the emergency cardiac medications, including nitroglycerin, morphine, aspirin, and the drugs they would need if the patient's heart stopped. Maria checked the portable monitors and the oxygen tanks and made sure the stretcher straps were ready. The flight took 27 minutes, and during that time the crew stayed focused and professional. But there was also something else in the air, something that connected them to this mission on a deeper level. They were all military, and they all understood the bond between people who had served together and suffered together and survived together. Danny Martinez might be a stranger to them, but he was also a brother, because he had worn the uniform and served his country. That meant something profound and unbreakable. It meant they would do whatever it took to save him. As they approached St. Luke's Hospital, Andrew brought the Black Hawk down low and circled once to assess the landing area. The parking lot was full of cars, but there was a clear space near the emergency room entrance that would work. Greg radioed the hospital to let them know a military medevac helicopter was about to land in their parking lot, and there was a moment of confused silence on the other end before someone said, "Okay." Andrew did not wait for more discussion because this was an emergency, and they had authorization from a general, and sometimes you had to break the normal rules to do the right thing. The Black Hawk descended toward the parking lot with its rotors creating a powerful downdraft that sent leaves and trash swirling through the air. People in the parking lot stopped and stared with their mouths open because it was not every day that a military helicopter landed at a civilian hospital. Inside the emergency room, nurses and doctors rushed to the windows to see what was happening, and patients in the waiting room stood up to get a better view. The Black Hawk's skids touched down on the asphalt with a solid thump, and Andrew kept the rotors at idle speed, ready to take off again as soon as they had the patient loaded. The side door of the Black Hawk slid open, and Maria Gonzalez jumped out first with the medical kit in her hands, followed immediately by Scott Hamilton carrying the portable stretcher. They moved with the kind of smooth coordination that came from training and experience, their boots hitting the pavement in rhythm as they ran toward the emergency room entrance. The downdraft from the rotors whipped their uniforms and made their hair stream back, but they barely noticed, because their focus was entirely on the mission. Hospital. Security guards started moving toward the helicopter with confused and alarmed expressions because this was definitely not normal procedure. But then Helen Price appeared from inside the building and held up her hand to stop them. Helen was the hospital administrator, and she was also a Navy veteran who had served as a medical officer for 6 years before transitioning to civilian health care. She recognized immediately what was happening because she understood the military culture and the bonds that connected service members across time and distance. She told the security guards to stand down and clear a path, and they obeyed even though they looked confused about why a military team was storming their emergency room. Maria and Scott burst through the automatic doors into the waiting room, and the noise of normal hospital activity seemed to stop for a moment as everyone turned to stare at the two people in military uniforms carrying medical equipment. Scott's eyes swept the room quickly and professionally, looking for their patient, and Maria was already moving toward the triage desk to get information. But before they could ask, a woman stood up from her chair near the back of the waiting room and pointed toward the emergency room doors. "They took him back there about 10 minutes ago. The man who looked like he was having a heart attack," she said, and her voice had the crisp tone of someone who had military training. The woman was Claire Dixon, and she was a retired Army nurse who had been waiting for her own appointment when she saw Danny Martinez deteriorating in his chair. She had 20 years of experience in military medicine, including 3 deployments to combat zones, and she had recognized the signs of a major cardiac event immediately. When the hospital staff had finally gotten Danny onto an exam table, Claire had followed and watched from the doorway to make sure they were doing everything right. Now she looked at Maria and Scott with knowing eyes and said, "I can take you to him." The three of them moved quickly through the emergency room doors and down a corridor lined with exam rooms and medical equipment. Claire led them to exam room 7, where Danny Martinez lay on a table with IV lines in his arm and monitor leads stuck to his chest. A civilian ER doctor was standing next to the bed reviewing the monitor readouts, and he looked up in surprise when 3 people in military uniforms entered his exam room. Scott stepped forward and identified himself as Major Hamilton, emergency physician, and explained that they were here to transport the patient to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. The civilian doctor, whose name was Benjamin Cole, started to protest because this was highly irregular and there were protocols and procedures that needed to be followed. But Scott's voice was firm and calm when he said, "This patient is a veteran having a major cardiac event and your hospital is overwhelmed and cannot provide immediate cardiac catheterization. We have a fully equipped medevac helicopter, ready to transport him to Walter Reed where a cardiac team is standing by. Every minute we delay decreases his chance of survival." The words hung in the air and Dr. Cole looked at the monitor showing Danny's irregular heart rhythm and knew that everything Scott said was true. Helen Price appeared in the doorway at that moment, and when Dr. Cole looked at her for guidance, she simply nodded. "Let them do their job," she said, and there was something in her tone that came from her own military experience. An understanding that sometimes the right thing to do was not the same as the normal thing to do. Dr. Cole stepped back and watched as Maria and Scott moved into action with the smooth efficiency of a well-trained team. Maria checked Danny's IV lines and monitor leads while Scott listened to his heart and lungs with a stethoscope. Danny's eyes were half open but unfocused, and his skin had a gray pallor that indicated poor circulation. His blood pressure was dangerously low, and his heart rhythm was showing signs of ventricular tachycardia, which could lead to cardiac arrest at any moment. Scott pulled medications from his kit and administered them through the IV line, while Maria prepared the portable monitor and oxygen equipment for transport. "Claire." Dixon moved to Danny's other side and took his hand, speaking to him in a calm voice even though she did not know him. "Stay with us, Marine. Your brothers are here and we are going to take care of you." Danny's eyes focused on her for just a moment and his lips moved like he was trying to say something but no sound came out. Claire squeezed his hand and kept talking to him, using the steady, reassuring tone she had developed over 20 years of keeping scared and injured soldiers calm during medical emergencies. They transferred Danny from the hospital bed to the military stretcher with careful coordinated movements, making sure not to dislodge any of the IV lines or monitor leads. Maria secured the straps across his chest and legs while Scott connected the portable monitors and checked all the readings. Then they started moving toward the exit, rolling the stretcher quickly but smoothly through the corridor. Claire walked alongside them without being asked, and Scott made a quick decision, looking at her and saying, "You are coming with us. We need experienced hands." The group emerged from the emergency room into the parking lot where a crowd had gathered to watch the Black Hawk helicopter sitting with its rotors spinning. Other patients from the waiting room had come outside, and many of them were veterans themselves, recognizing the uniform and the mission and understanding what was happening. As Maria and Scott wheeled Danny toward the helicopter, something remarkable occurred. The veterans in the crowd stood at attention and raised their hands in salute, honoring a fellow service member in his moment of crisis. An old man with a Vietnam veteran baseball cap had tears running down his weathered face as he held his salute. A younger woman with an army jacket stood straight and still with her hand to her forehead. A middle-aged man in a wheelchair with prosthetic legs saluted from his seated position. They all understood the bond. They all felt the connection to Danny Martinez, even though most of them had never met him. This was what it meant to be part of the military family. To know that when one person fell, others would come running without question or hesitation. Maria and Scott loaded the stretcher into the Blackhawk's medical bay with practiced movements, and Claire climbed in behind them. The space was cramped with equipment and 3 medical personnel plus the patient, but everyone knew their role and moved efficiently. Maria secured the stretcher to the deck mount points while Scott connected Danny to the helicopter's more advanced monitoring systems. Claire positioned herself at Danny's head where she could maintain his airway and talk to him, keeping him calm and focused. Andrew Fisher in the cockpit got the signal that everyone was loaded, and he immediately increased power to the rotors. Greg Holland was already on the radio with air traffic control and Walter Reed Hospital, coordinating their arrival and making sure the cardiac team would be ready. The Black Hawk lifted off the parking lot with a surge of power and climbed into the sky, banking hard toward the northeast. Below them, the crowd of veterans remained standing at attention, their salutes held until the helicopter disappeared from view. The Black Hawk climbed to 3,000 feet and leveled off as Andrew Fisher pushed the helicopter to maximum cruising speed. In the medical bay, Scott Hamilton and Maria Gonzalez worked with intense focus while Claire Dixon maintained her position at Danny's head. The helicopter's medical compartment was designed for exactly this kind of emergency, with every piece of equipment mounted securely and within easy reach. The noise from the rotors and engines was loud, but everyone wore headsets that allowed them to communicate clearly over the internal radio system. Maria watched the cardiac monitor with sharp eyes as the numbers flickered and changed. Danny's heart rhythm was unstable, showing a pattern that could deteriorate into full cardiac arrest at any moment. His blood pressure remained dangerously low despite the medications they had given him, and his oxygen saturation was dropping slowly but steadily. She called out the vital signs over the headset, and Scott nodded, already preparing another dose of medication to try to stabilize the failing heart. Scott administered the drugs through the IV line with steady hands, even though the helicopter was vibrating and occasionally bouncing through rough air. He had done this hundreds of times during his deployments to Afghanistan, where he had treated wounded soldiers in helicopters and field hospitals and makeshift aid stations. The environment was always chaotic and uncomfortable, but you learned to block out everything except the patient in front of you. The only thing that mattered was keeping them alive long enough to get them to definitive care. Claire kept talking to Danny in a calm, steady voice, telling him to stay with them and reminding him that help was coming and he was going to be okay. Danny's eyes would open briefly and then close again, and his breathing was shallow and labored even with the oxygen mask on his face. Claire had seen this pattern many times before in soldiers who were critically injured and fighting to survive. The body wanted to shut down and give up, but the mind kept fighting, and sometimes that mental strength was the difference between life and death. The portable defibrillator sat ready next to the stretcher, charged and prepared in case Danny's heart stopped completely. Maria kept one hand near it while monitoring the cardiac rhythm, watching for the telltale changes that would indicate ventricular fibrillation. If that happened, they would have only seconds to deliver an electrical shock to restart the heart, and even then, the chances of success were uncertain. The statistics ran through her mind automatically from years of training. Survival rates for cardiac arrest decreased by 10% for every minute without defibrillation, and they were 43 minutes away from Walter Reed. In the cockpit, Greg Holland maintained constant radio communication with air traffic control and military coordination centers. They had priority clearance along their entire flight path, and every controller was moving aircraft out of their way and clearing airspace ahead of them. Greg also kept Walter Reed Hospital updated on their estimated arrival time and Danny's condition, so the cardiac team could be fully prepared. The hospital had already mobilized their best cardiologist, and a full surgical team was standing by in case emergency bypass surgery was needed. Andrew flew the Black Hawk with aggressive precision, cutting corners where it was safe and maintaining maximum speed. He knew that every minute mattered for the patient in the back, and he also knew that his own skills as a pilot could make the difference between success and failure. The helicopter responded smoothly to his control inputs as they raced across the landscape below, passing over highways and towns and forests. The autumn afternoon sun was bright and clear, providing perfect visibility for the flight. 20 minutes into the flight, the situation in the medical bay suddenly became more critical. Maria saw the cardiac monitor change to a pattern she had been dreading: ventricular tachycardia progressing toward ventricular fibrillation. "He is crashing," she called out over the headset, and Scott immediately moved into position. Claire began manual ventilation with a bag valve mask to ensure Danny was getting enough oxygen while Scott prepared to defibrillate if necessary. The monitor alarm started beeping urgently as Danny's heart rhythm became more chaotic. Scott grabbed the defibrillator paddles and placed them on Danny's chest in the correct positions, while Maria cut away his shirt to ensure good contact. "Clear," Scott called out, and Maria and Claire pulled their hands away from the patient and the metal stretcher. Scott pressed the buttons and Danny's body jerked as the electrical shock traveled through his heart. They all looked at the monitor to see if the rhythm would convert back to something survivable. For 3 seconds that felt like hours, the monitor showed a flat line. Then a beep appeared, followed by another, and slowly a rhythm emerged that was weak but regular. Danny's heart was beating again, though barely, and his blood pressure started to climb slightly. Scott let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and Maria immediately started checking the IV lines and preparing more medications to support the fragile rhythm they had just restored. Claire leaned down close to Danny's ear and said, "You are still here, Marine. Keep fighting. We are almost there." Danny's eyelids fluttered but did not open, and his breathing was barely perceptible even with the oxygen mask. But he was alive, and that was what mattered. Every minute he stayed alive was another. Find it closer to the cardiac catheterization lab at Walter Reed, where skilled surgeons could repair the damage to his heart. Andrew had heard the emergency over the headset, and he pushed the Blackhawk even faster, knowing they were in a race against time. He called ahead to Walter Reed and requested immediate landing clearance and ground support to get the patient from the helipad to the cardiac lab as quickly as possible. The hospital responded that everything was ready, and they would have a team waiting on the pad. Greg updated their estimated arrival time, 18 minutes. In those 18 minutes, the medical team in the back of the helicopter performed a delicate balancing act, giving Danny enough medication to keep his heart beating, but not so much that it would cause other complications. They monitored every vital sign constantly, watching for any change that might indicate another crisis. Maria adjusted the IV drip rates while Scott listened to Danny's heart and lungs every few minutes. Claire maintained the airway and kept talking to Danny even though he could not respond, because she believed on some level he could hear her and her voice might give him something to hold on to. The Black Hawk crossed over the Potomac River, and the buildings of Washington, D.C. appeared ahead of them, including the distinctive shape of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Andrew contacted the tower and received immediate clearance to land on the hospital's helipad, and he began his descent with smooth control inputs. The helicopter dropped altitude quickly but smoothly, and through the windows they could see the medical team assembled on the helipad waiting for them. Greg called out altitude and airspeed to help Andrew with the landing, and the Blackhawk settled onto the helipad with barely a bump. Before the skids had fully compressed, the side door was sliding open and the Walter Reed medical team was rushing forward with a gurney. Scott and Maria had already unstrapped Danny from the stretcher mount points and were ready to transfer him immediately. The coordination between the flight crew and the hospital team was seamless, everyone moving with purpose and efficiency. They lifted Danny onto the hospital gurney and Scott gave a rapid verbal report to the waiting cardiologist, Dr. Frank Murphy, covering everything that had happened during the flight and all the medications they had administered. Maria handed over the portable monitor so they could see the trending data from the flight. Claire stepped back to let the hospital team work, but she kept her eyes on Danny, silently willing him to keep fighting just a little bit longer. The Walter Reed medical team moved Danny through the hospital corridors at a controlled run, with Dr. Frank Murphy leading the way and calling out orders to his staff. Scott Hamilton and Claire Dixon followed alongside the gurney, providing continuity of care and additional hands if needed. The hospital had cleared the route ahead of time, so there were no delays or obstacles. Just smooth movement from the helipad through the corridors to the cardiac catheterization lab. The cardiac lab was a state-of-the-art facility equipped with the latest imaging technology and intervention tools. The room was already prepped and ready with a team of nurses and technicians standing by. They transferred Danny from the gurney to the procedure table with careful coordinated movements, making sure not to dislodge any of the monitoring equipment or IV lines. Dr. Murphy scrubbed in quickly while his team connected Danny to the lab's advanced monitoring systems and prepared the imaging equipment. Admiral Joseph Kent, the hospital commander, stood in the observation area above the cardiac lab watching through the glass. He was a career Navy officer with silver hair and a straight military bearing, and he had personally cleared his schedule to oversee this case. When General Burton had called him about the incoming emergency, the admiral had not hesitated to mobilize his best team and provide whatever resources were needed. Taking care of veterans was not just a job to him. It was a sacred duty that came with wearing the uniform. In the procedure room, Dr. Murphy examined the preliminary imaging and blood work results while his team worked around him. The test confirmed what he had suspected from Scott's report. Danny Martinez had a severe blockage in his left anterior descending artery, the major vessel that supplies blood to the front and left side of the heart. This type of blockage was often called the widowmaker because it was so frequently fatal. The fact that Danny had survived this long was due to luck and the quick actions of the people who had come to his aid. Time was critical now because even though Danny's heart was still beating, the muscle tissue downstream from the blockage was dying from lack of oxygen. Every minute that passed meant more permanent damage to the heart. Dr. Murphy spoke to his team in calm, clear tones, outlining the procedure they would perform. They would thread a thin catheter through an artery in Danny's groin and guide it up through his vascular system to his heart. Using imaging guidance, they would navigate the catheter to the blocked artery and then use a balloon to open it up and place a stent to keep it open. The procedure began with Dr. Murphy making a small incision in Danny's groin and inserting a guide wire into the femoral artery. He worked with steady hands and total concentration, feeling the wire advance through the vessel and watching its progress on the imaging screens. His team assisted with practiced efficiency, anticipating his needs and keeping everything running smoothly. The room was quiet except for the beeping of monitors and the soft hum of medical equipment. Scott and Claire watched from the observation area alongside Admiral Kent, both of them knowing there was nothing more they could do now except hope and wait. Scott felt the familiar tension that came with watching another doctor work on a critical patient, wanting to help, but knowing he needed to trust in the skills of the specialist. Claire stood with her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on Danny's still form on the table below, and she found herself silently praying even though she was not particularly religious. The catheter advanced slowly through Danny's arterial system, guided by Dr. Murphy's expert hands and the real-time imaging on the screens. When it reached the heart, the team could see the blockage clearly on the monitors, a dark shadow in the artery where blood flow was severely restricted. Dr. Murphy positioned the catheter carefully and then deployed a tiny balloon at the site of the blockage. When he inflated the balloon, it pushed against the blockage and compressed it against the artery walls, opening up the channel for blood flow. The monitors showed immediate improvement in blood flow to the affected area of Danny's heart, but Dr. Murphy was not done yet. He deflated and removed the balloon and then threaded a stent through the catheter, a small mesh tube that would hold the artery open permanently. He positioned the stent exactly where it needed to be and then expanded it, locking it into place against the artery walls. The entire procedure took 47 minutes from start to finish, and when it was complete, the imaging showed clear blood flow through the previously blocked artery. Dr. Murphy stepped back from the table and removed his surgical magnifying glasses, letting out a long breath. His team continued to monitor Danny's vital signs and saw encouraging improvements: blood pressure rising, heart rhythm stabilizing, oxygen saturation increasing. The cardiac muscle that had been starved of oxygen was now receiving fresh blood flow, and if they had acted quickly enough, most of it would recover with minimal permanent damage. Dr. Murphy turned to look up at the observation window, where Admiral Kent stood watching, and he gave a simple thumbs-up gesture. In the observation area, Scott felt relief wash over him, and Claire actually smiled, something she had not done in hours. Admiral Kent nodded with satisfaction, and then left to go speak with the people waiting for news. The waiting area had filled up over the past hour with an impressive group. Kyle Stevens had driven at dangerous speeds from the Pentagon and arrived just as the Black Hawk was landing. Colonel Patricia Hayes had taken a military helicopter from Fort Bragg and touched down 20 minutes ago. Other members of Danny's old unit had been arriving steadily, flying in from different parts of the country after hearing the news through their veteran network. They sat together in the waiting area. This group of Marines and soldiers who had served with Danny Martinez 15 years ago in Fallujah. They did not talk much because they did not need to. The bond they shared ran deeper than words, forged in combat and hardship and shared sacrifice. They had seen each other at their worst and at their best, and they had trusted each other with their lives. Now they waited together to find out if their brother would survive, and every one of them would have traded places with Danny if they could. Admiral Kent walked into the waiting area, and the veterans all stood up immediately out of habit and respect for the officer. The admiral told them to sit, and then he delivered the news in his clear command voice. The procedure was successful. Dr. Murphy was able to clear the blockage and place a stent. Your friend's heart is beating on its own and his vital signs are improving. He is going to make it. The words hung in the air for a moment, and then Kyle Stevens sat down heavily in his chair and put his face in his hands. Patricia Hayes blinked back tears, and several of the other veterans embraced each other. The admiral continued speaking, explaining that Danny would be taken to the cardiac intensive care unit, where he would be monitored closely for the next several days. He would need time to recover, and there would be rehabilitation and lifestyle changes, but the doctors expected him to make a full recovery. The admiral also said that what had happened today was remarkable. From the quick response of the rescue team to the successful emergency intervention, and everyone involved should be proud of their actions. Kyle Stevens stood up and faced Admiral Kent, his voice rough with emotion when he spoke. "Sir, we need to thank you and General Burton and everyone who made this happen. Danny saved my life in Iraq, and I could not let him down when he needed help. None of us could." The admiral nodded and said, "That is what this is all about, taking care of the people who served our country. Today we got it right." The group settled in to wait for visiting hours when they could see Danny, and they swapped stories about their deployment together and the crazy things they had done and the scary moments they had survived. The conversation was easier now that they knew Danny would be okay, and there was even some laughter mixed in with the memories. These were people who had been through hell together and come out the other side, and nothing could break the bond they shared. 3 days passed before Danny Martinez fully woke up in his private room at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. His first sensation was confusion about where he was and why his chest hurt, and why there were tubes and wires connected to his body. Then memory came flooding back in fragments. The pain in the waiting room, the message to his old unit, the feeling of his heart failing. He tried to sit up, but his body was weak and the movement made alarms beep on the monitors next to his bed. A nurse appeared within seconds. A kind-faced woman named Linda, who had been checking on Danny every 30 minutes since he arrived in the cardiac intensive care unit. She gently pushed him back against the pillows and told him to stay still and rest. She explained that he had suffered a major heart attack and undergone emergency surgery, and he needed to let his body heal. Danny's voice was hoarse when he asked what had happened, and Linda smiled and said, "You have some visitors who can explain everything better than I can." She left the room and returned a minute later, followed by Kyle Stevens. Kyle looked tired with dark circles under his eyes, but his face broke into a huge grin when he saw Danny awake and alert. He walked over to the bed and gripped Danny's hand, and for a moment neither of them spoke because the emotion was too strong. Finally, Kyle said, "You scared the hell out of us, brother." Danny tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace because his chest hurt from the procedure. Over the next hour, Kyle explained everything that had happened after Danny sent the message to the group chat. He told Danny about the frantic phone calls and General Burton's decision to send the Black Hawk and the dramatic landing in the hospital parking lot. He described how the military medical team had stabilized Danny and flown him to Walter Reed, where Dr. Murphy had performed the life-saving procedure. Danny listened with growing amazement, unable to believe that so many people had moved so quickly just to save him. Why would the general risk his career like that? Danny asked, and Kyle shook his head. He did not see it as a risk, he saw it as his duty. You served your country, and when you needed help, the country showed up for you. That is how it should be. Kyle paused and then added, "Besides, you pulled me out of that burning Humvee in Fallujah. Did you think I would not come for you now?" Patricia Hayes visited later that afternoon, bringing flowers and a card signed by everyone from their old unit. She sat in the chair next to Danny's bed, and they talked about old times and caught up on the years since they had last seen each other. Patricia was a colonel now, and Danny was proud of her success, even though she insisted that rank did not matter between them. They were Marines first and always, and that bond transcended military hierarchy. Over the following days, more visitors came to see Danny. Scott Hamilton stopped by to check on his patient and seemed pleased with the recovery progress. Maria Gonzalez brought a care package from the flight crew with snacks and magazines and a Black Hawk squadron patch. Claire Dixon visited every day, and she and Danny discovered they had served in adjacent areas during overlapping deployments in Iraq. They had never met during their service, but they knew many of the same people and had experienced similar events. A friendship began to form between them. built on shared understanding of military life and service. Admiral Kent visited Danny personally to welcome him to Walter Reed and assure him that he would receive the best possible care. The Admiral explained that Danny's case had already created waves at the highest levels of military leadership. The video of the Black Hawk landing at St. Luke's Hospital had gone viral on social media with millions of views and thousands of comments from veterans and civilians alike. People were calling it an incredible display of military brotherhood and questioning why such dramatic measures had been necessary to get a veteran the emergency care he needed. The story had reached the Secretary of Defense, who, instead of reprimanding General Burton, had commended him for his quick thinking and decisive action. The Secretary had ordered a review of protocols for providing emergency medical support to veterans, with the goal of creating clear guidelines so that military medical resources could be used to help former service members in crisis situations. The program was being called the Martinez Protocol, though Danny protested that he did not deserve to have anything named after him. "You do deserve it," Admiral Kent said firmly. "Your case highlighted a gap in our system, and now we are fixing it. Because of what happened to you, other veterans in similar situations will get help faster. That is something to be proud of." Danny did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded and thanked the Admiral for everything the hospital had done for him. Physical therapy started on the 5th day, with a therapist named Gary, who had Danny walking short distances in the hallway while monitors tracked his heart rhythm. The exercise was exhausting at first, but Danny pushed through it with the same determination that had gotten him through Marine Corps training decades ago. Gary was impressed with his patient's attitude and told him that mental toughness was half the battle in cardiac recovery. Claire often walked with Danny during these therapy sessions, keeping pace beside him and encouraging him when he got tired. She had taken leave from her civilian job to stay in the area while Danny recovered, saying she wanted to make sure he was okay before she went back home. Danny appreciated her presence more than he could express in words, and they spent hours talking about their experiences in the military and their struggles to adjust to civilian life afterward. One afternoon, Kyle brought his laptop to Danny's room and showed him the social media posts about his rescue. There were videos shot by bystanders showing the Black Hawk landing in the parking lot and the medical team rushing into the hospital. There were photos of veterans saluting as Danny was carried to the helicopter. The comments were overwhelmingly positive, with thousands of veterans sharing their own stories about the bonds they had formed during service and the ways they had helped each other in civilian life. Danny watched the videos with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by the realization of how many people had come together to save him. He had always seen himself as just a regular guy who did his job and tried to help people when he could. He had never thought of himself as special or deserving of extraordinary measures. But now he understood that the brotherhood of military service meant that no one was just a regular guy. Everyone mattered and everyone was worth saving. "I do not know how to repay all of this," Danny said quietly, and Kyle put a hand on his shoulder. "You do not need to repay anything. You just need to get better and live your life and maybe help the next veteran who needs it. That is how this works. We take care of each other and we pay it forward." Danny nodded because he understood that concept from his time in the Marines, the idea that you never really left the service. You just changed the way you served. By the end of the first week, Danny was walking longer distances and his heart function tests showed good improvement. Dr. Murphy was pleased with the recovery and said that Danny would be able to go home soon, though he would need to attend cardiac rehabilitation and make significant lifestyle changes. No more greasy food, no more skipping exercise, and absolutely no more ignoring symptoms when something felt wrong. Danny promised to follow all the instructions because he did not want to waste the second chance he had been given. While Danny Martinez recovered at Walter Reed, his story continued to spread across the country and spark important conversations about veteran health care and emergency response. News organizations picked up the viral videos and ran stories about the dramatic Black Hawk rescue, interviewing witnesses from the hospital and military officials about what had happened. The story resonated with people because it showed something positive and heroic at a time when the news was usually full of negativity and division. General Richard Burton became an unexpected spokesman for veteran issues when reporters started calling Fort Bragg asking for interviews. At first he declined because he was uncomfortable with media attention, but then Admiral Kent convinced him that speaking publicly could help push for better policies to support veterans. So the general agreed to do a few interviews, and he spoke with passion about the obligation the military and the country had to take care of people who had served. Danny Martinez wore the uniform and served his country with honor, the general said during one televised interview. When he needed help, it should not have required extraordinary measures to get him care. The fact that we had to bend rules and push boundaries to save his life means our system has failures that need to be fixed. Every veteran should know that if they are in crisis, help will come immediately without bureaucratic delays or resource limitations. The interviews went viral themselves, and suddenly veterans across the country were sharing their own stories about struggles with the VA healthcare system and civilian hospitals that did not understand military medicine or culture. The stories ranged from minor frustrations to serious failures of care, and they painted a picture of a system that often let veterans down despite good intentions. Politicians began paying attention because the issue was getting public traction, and veterans represented a significant voting bloc. The Secretary of Defense moved quickly to get ahead of the issue by announcing the creation of the Martinez Protocol, a new set of guidelines that would allow military medical assets to respond to veteran emergencies when civilian resources were inadequate. The protocol established clear authorization procedures and coordination mechanisms between military bases and civilian hospitals. It also created a hotline that veterans could call to request emergency military medical assistance, staffed by people who understood military culture and could make quick decisions. Kyle Stevens was offered a position helping to develop and implement the Martinez Protocol, and he accepted immediately because it felt like meaningful work that could make a real difference. He spent his days writing policy documents and training materials, working with medical professionals and veterans advocates to create a system that would actually work in real crisis situations. It was challenging and sometimes frustrating, but Kyle felt like he was finally doing something that honored the sacrifice of people like Danny, who had served their country. Patricia Hayes worked with Kyle on the military side of the protocol, helping to establish response procedures at bases across the country. They identified which bases had medevac capabilities and medical facilities that could handle different types of emergencies. They created training programs so that military medical personnel would be prepared to respond to veteran emergencies alongside their normal duties. The work was extensive, but both of them felt driven by the knowledge that this could save lives. At Walter Reed, Admiral Kent assembled a team to study Danny's case in detail and identify lessons learned that could improve future responses. They analyzed everything from the initial communication, through the group chat to the helicopter, landing at the civilian hospital to the handoff at Walter Reed. They found things that had worked well and things that could be improved, and they documented all of it in a comprehensive report that was distributed throughout the military medical system. One of the key findings was the importance of communication networks among veterans. Danny's old unit group chat had been the catalyst for his rescue because it allowed rapid communication with people who had the connections and knowledge to get help quickly. The report recommended encouraging veterans to maintain these informal networks and even suggested creating official platforms where veterans could connect with each other and with military support resources. Another finding was the value of having veterans in key positions throughout the healthcare system. Helen Price at St. Luke's Hospital had recognized what was happening and facilitated the military team's access because of her own Navy background. Claire Dixon had provided critical care during the flight because of her Army nursing experience. These individuals had bridged the gap between military and civilian systems because they understood both worlds. The report recommended recruiting more veterans into healthcare administration and emergency medicine roles. Media coverage of the Martinez Protocol was generally positive, with most commentators praising the military for taking action to better support veterans. Some critics worried about the cost and logistics of maintaining emergency response capabilities for veteran crises, but supporters argued that the country owed at least this much to people who had risked their lives in service. Veterans organizations threw their support behind the protocol and began advocating for its full funding and implementation. Danny watched all of this unfold from his hospital room with a mixture of pride and discomfort. He was glad that his experience might help other veterans, but he struggled with being held up as a symbol or example. He still saw himself as just a regular mechanic who had gotten sick and been lucky enough to have good friends. Kyle and Patricia visited often and tried to help him understand that his humility was part of what made the story powerful, that people connected with someone who did not seek attention but simply tried to do right by others. "You are not comfortable being called a hero," Kyle said during one visit. "But that is exactly why people respect you. You saved my life in Fallujah, and you never talked about it or expected anything in return. You were just doing what you thought was right. Now the country is trying to do what is right for you and for all veterans, and you should let that happen." 2 weeks after his heart attack, Danny was discharged from Walter Reed with a comprehensive care plan and instructions for cardiac rehabilitation. He would be staying with Kyle and his wife for a few weeks while he continued outpatient therapy and follow-up appointments. Claire had arranged to visit regularly to check on his progress, and several members of his old unit had volunteered to help with whatever he needed. Danny was overwhelmed by the support but also grateful beyond words. The day of his discharge, Admiral Kent came to say goodbye personally. He shook Danny's hand and told him that his case had already changed military medicine in important ways. "You served your country once by putting on the uniform," the Admiral said. "Now you have served it again by showing us where we needed to do better. I am proud to have played a small part in your care, and I wish you all the best in your recovery." Danny left Walter Reed through the front entrance where a small group had gathered to see him off. It included hospital staff who had cared for him, members of the Black Hawk crew who had flown him there, and several veterans who had heard about his story and wanted to show support. Someone started clapping and then others joined in until there was a round of applause that followed Danny to Kyle's car. He waved awkwardly and climbed into the passenger seat, still not entirely comfortable with the attention, but touched by the gesture. As they drove away from the hospital, Danny looked back at the building where so many skilled and caring people had worked to save his life. He thought about the chain of events that had started with a desperate message to old friends and ended with national policy changes. He thought about the Black Hawk touching down in that hospital parking lot and the veterans saluting as he was carried aboard. Most of all, he thought about the unbreakable bonds of military service and how they had literally saved his life when he needed help most. 6 months after his heart attack, Danny Martinez stood in the parking lot of St. Luke's Medical Center, looking at the spot where the Black Hawk had landed to save his life. The hospital had placed a small plaque there commemorating the event and recognizing the coordination between military and civilian medical services. Danny had been invited to the dedication ceremony, along with the people who had participated in his rescue, and he had reluctantly agreed to attend because Kyle convinced him it was important. The parking lot was filled with people for the ceremony, including hospital staff, local veterans, military officials, and media representatives. Helen Price gave a speech about the importance of community partnerships and taking care of those who had served the nation. General Burton spoke via video link about the Martinez Protocol and how it had already been used successfully in several other veteran emergency situations. Admiral Kent attended in person and talked about the pride Walter Reed took in serving veterans and active duty personnel alike. Then it was Danny's turn to speak, and he walked to the podium feeling nervous and out of place. He had never been comfortable with public speaking, and he still struggled to understand why his story mattered so much to so many people. But he looked out at the crowd and saw Kyle and Patricia and Claire and the members of the Black Hawk crew, and he knew he owed it to them to say something meaningful. 6 months ago, I sat in that waiting room thinking I was going to die, Danny began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. I sent a message to my old unit asking for help, not really knowing what anyone could do but feeling like I had to reach out to my brothers. What happened next was something I never could have imagined. A general I had never met authorized a military helicopter to come get me. Doctors and medics I had never met risked their careers to provide emergency care. A nurse I had never met jumped on that helicopter to help save my life. He paused and looked at Claire, who was standing in the front row, and she smiled at him with encouragement. Danny continued, I learned that the bonds we form through military service do not end when we take off the uniform. We carry those bonds with us for life, and when one of us falls, the others come running without question or hesitation. That is what happened to me, and because people cared enough to act, I am still here today. I am grateful beyond words, and I hope that what happened can help other veterans who find themselves in crisis. The crowd applauded, and Danny stepped away from the podium, relieved to be done with the speech. Kyle came up and hugged him. and Patricia shook his hand with obvious pride. Several veterans in the crowd approached to thank him for speaking and to share their own stories about times when fellow veterans had helped them. Danny listened to each story with genuine interest, beginning to understand that his experience was part of a larger pattern of veterans taking care of each other. After the ceremony, the Black Hawk crew invited Danny to visit Fort Bragg and see the helicopter that had saved his life. He agreed, and the following week he made the trip with Claire, who had become a close friend during his recovery. Captain Andrew Fisher met them at the base entrance and drove them to the flight line, where the Black Hawk sat gleaming in the sun. Danny walked around the helicopter slowly, running his hand along the fuselage and looking at the medical equipment visible through the open doors. Maria Gonzalez was there, and she showed Danny the medical bay where she and Scott had worked to keep him alive during the flight. She explained how the equipment worked and pointed out where each of them had been positioned during the emergency. Danny listened with fascination, trying to imagine what it had been like from their perspective. He thanked Maria repeatedly for her skill and dedication, and she brushed off the gratitude, saying she had just been doing her job. Lieutenant Greg Holland took Danny up to the cockpit and let him sit in the co-pilot seat. Greg explained the controls and instruments and described what the flight had been like that day, racing to St. Luke's and then to Walter Reed with a critically ill patient in the back. "We were all focused on getting you there as fast as possible," Greg said. "Every second mattered, and we knew it. Captain Fisher flew like a man possessed, and air traffic control gave us priority over everything else in the sky." They had lunch in the base dining facility with General Burton, who had specifically requested to meet Danny in person. The general was warm and friendly despite his high rank, and he asked Danny about his recovery and his plans for the future. Danny explained that he was back to work part-time at the garage and attending cardiac rehabilitation sessions twice a week. His heart function had improved significantly, and his doctors were pleased with his progress. "I want you to know that what we did for you was not just about one person," General Burton said. "It was about sending a message that we take care of our veterans no matter what it takes. The Martinez Protocol has already helped dozens of veterans get emergency care they needed, and that number will keep growing. You should be proud of the change you helped create, even though I know you never sought attention or recognition." Danny nodded and thanked the general again for taking the risk to authorize his rescue. General Burton smiled and said, "It was not a risk, it was a duty, and I would do it again tomorrow if needed." On the drive back home, Danny and Claire talked about how much their lives had changed in 6 months. Claire had taken a new job at a veterans hospital where she could use her skills to help former service members. She said Danny's story had inspired her to refocus her career on serving the veteran community. Danny was thinking about getting more involved with veteran organizations himself, maybe volunteering to help connect veterans with resources and support. "I spent years just keeping my head down and trying to get by," Danny said. "I did not stay connected with my old unit or with the veteran community in general. I thought I was supposed to just move on and not dwell on my military service, but now I understand that those connections are valuable. They are lifelines that can save you when you need help. I want to help other veterans understand that too." Claire agreed and said that too many veterans isolated themselves after leaving the service, trying to handle everything alone instead of reaching out to the community that understood them best. "We need to change that culture," she said. "We need veterans to know it is okay to ask for help, and that help will come when they need it." 3 months later, Danny received a letter from the Department of Defense inviting him to Washington for a formal recognition ceremony. The Martinez Protocol was being officially launched nationwide, and the Secretary of Defense wanted to honor the people who had made it possible. Danny tried to decline, but Kyle and Patricia insisted he attend, arguing that his presence would bring attention to the program and help more veterans learn about it. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon in a large auditorium filled with military officials, veterans advocates, and media representatives. Danny sat in the front row with Kyle and Patricia and Claire in the Black Hawk crew and General Burton and Admiral Kent. The Secretary of Defense gave a speech about the importance of veteran care and announced that the Martinez Protocol was now fully operational at military installations across the country. Then he called Danny to the stage and presented him with a civilian award for his unintentional contribution to improving veteran emergency care. Danny accepted the award with shaking hands and gave a brief speech, thanking everyone who had helped him and emphasizing that the real heroes were the people who had responded to his crisis. The audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes, and Danny stood there overwhelmed by the recognition and the realization of how many lives might be saved by the system his experience had helped create. After the ceremony, Danny was surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand and thank him and share their own veteran stories. He listened to each person with genuine interest and compassion, offering words of encouragement and connection information for support resources. He realized that this was his new mission, helping veterans connect with each other and with the help they needed. It was not what he had planned for his life, but it felt right and meaningful. That evening, the whole group gathered for dinner at a restaurant near the Pentagon. They toasted to Danny's recovery, and to the bonds of military service and to the future of veteran care. Stories were shared and laughter filled the table, and for a while it felt like they were all back in their deployment days when they had relied on each other for everything. The years had changed them all in different ways, but the core connection remained unbreakable. Danny looked around the table at these people who had saved his life and changed his future, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude and belonging. He had sent a desperate message asking for help 6 months ago, and the response had been overwhelming and life-changing. A Black Hawk had touched down in a hospital parking lot because people cared enough to bend rules and take risks. A new protocol had been created because leaders recognized a failing in the system. Lives had been saved and would continue to be saved because veterans took care of each other. The brotherhood was unbroken and it would always endure, a promise kept across time and distance and circumstances. Danny Martinez understood that now in a way he never had before.